Preface: How to read this book. This book is not a guide, a manual, or a set of instructions. It does not offer steps, solutions, or diagnoses. It does not promise healing, resolution, or certainty. What it offers instead is orientation, a way of understanding experience that has often been mislabeled, minimized, or misunderstood. The chapters that follow are written from lived experience, but they are not meant to be read as confession or autobiography alone. They trace patterns, relational, psychological, and systemic, that shape how certain people learn to survive in environments that invalidate sensitivity, perception, and emotional truth. You do not need to identify as an INFJ to recognize yourself here. The INFJ framework is used as a language for patterns of perception and meaning making, not as a fixed identity or psychological category. If the descriptions resonate, that resonance matters more than the label. This book is also not meant to be consumed quickly. Some sections may feel immediately familiar. Others may provoke resistance, discomfort, or quiet recognition that arrives later. You are not required to agree with everything in order for the material to be useful. Reflection matters more than alignment. If you're looking for techniques, advice, or reassurance, this may feel disorienting at first. If you are looking for recognition, for language that names experiences you have struggled to explain, this book is written for that purpose. Nothing here asks you to relive the past or to forgive it. Nothing here requires you to see suffering as meaningful or necessary. The aim is simpler and harder, to locate experience accurately without erasing context or turning adaptation into defect. Read slowly. Pause when needed. Let what resonates stand on its own without forcing coherence too quickly. This book does not tell you who to become. It invites you to recognize who you were forced to become and what may still exist beneath that adaptation. Author's note: this book is written from lived experience. It reflects how a sensitive, intuitive, and highly perceptive nervous system adapted over time with environments that were often invalidating, confusing, or misattuned. While some of the language used throughout may resemble clinical or diagnostic terminology, it is not presented as diagnosis. Terms such as trauma, collapse, adaptation, empathy, alienation, and awakening are used descriptively to name internal states, relational patterns, and survival responses, not to assign pathology or fixed identity. Many of the reactions described in these pages are commonly interpreted through individual or diagnostic frameworks. In this book, they are approached contextually, as responses shaped by prolonged relational strain, developmental misattunement, and systemic pressure. What may appear as fear is often recognition. What may appear as instability is often overload. What may appear as withdrawal is often preservation. The intent here is not to reject clinical psychology or therapeutic practice, but to emphasize the importance of history, environment, and power dynamics when interpreting human distress. This book does not argue that suffering defines a person. It argues that suffering leaves traces, and that understanding those traces requires looking beyond the individual to the systems, relationships, and narratives that shaped them. Before asking what is wrong with a person, this work invites a prior question. What happened around them long enough to shape how their system learned to function? I wrote this book because I could not find language that accurately reflected my own experience, language that did not reduce sensitivity to weakness, depth to dysfunction, or collapse to failure. What follows is not an instruction manual, a manifesto, or a clinical treatise. It is an attempt at coherence, an effort to translate lived experience into meaning without distortion, performance, or self-erasure. If this book resonates, it is not because it offers a label. It is because it offers recognition, and for many, recognition is the first condition of healing. Chapter 1: The Making of an INFJ. From my earliest memories, I lived inwardly. I did not experience childhood as something that unfolded primarily through play, noise, or social belonging. I experienced it as an interior landscape, quiet, vivid, self-contained. My attention naturally moved inward toward thought, sensation, imagination, and meaning. I could spend long stretches absorbed in my own perceptions, like following emotional currents and internal images with a depth that felt natural and sustaining. I was content there. More than content, I was safe. Even as a very young child, I sensed that the external world required something from me that I didn't quite know how to give. Other children seemed to move with an ease and instinct I lacked. They slipped into social rhythms effortlessly, understanding rules that were never spoken aloud: when to speak, when to joke, when to compete, when to belong. I watched them do this with curiosity and quiet confusion. I didn't feel inferior so much as different, though at the time I had no language for that distinction. I only knew that the way I experienced the world didn't match what seemed to be expected of me. I was often described as sensitive, withdrawn, or slow. I had learning difficulties, was held back early on, and for many years believed, along with those around me, that something was wrong with me. The story formed early and repeated often: that I lagged behind, that I didn't quite keep up, that I needed extra help because I lacked something essential. Only much later would I understand that what looked like deficit was actually difference, a mind oriented toward pattern, meaning, and internal coherence rather than speed, surface performance, or rote compliance. At the time, however, all I knew was that I didn't belong in the ways that seemed to matter most. My inner world protected me. That distinction matters. I didn't retreat inward because I was broken. I retreated because the internal space was coherent, reliable, and alive in ways the external world was not. Inside, thoughts had texture. Feelings connected logically, even when circumstances didn't. Memories flowed into one another, forming patterns rather than fragments. There was continuity there, a sense that things made sense, even if they were painful. That internal continuity became my anchor. Losing it was never an option. Even as a child, I knew, intuitively, without articulation, that if I surrendered that inner coherence, there would be nothing left to stand on. I was the youngest child, the baby, and for a long time I was deeply loved, even doted on. My parents shielded me from harm, difficulty, and responsibility. Their protection came from genuine care, and I understood that even then. They sensed correctly that I was vulnerable. I wasn't loud, assertive, or socially resilient. I didn't push outward, I folded inward. I lived in my own world and they tried to guard it. But protection has a shadow. What began as care slowly became infantilization. As I grew older, the world expanded, but the role assigned to me did not. I was still treated as naive, fragile, incapable. Decisions were made for me rather than with me. Skills were withheld rather than taught. Risks were removed rather than navigated together. My development stalled not because I lacked ability, but because I was never trusted to struggle, fail, or grow on my own terms. I didn't refuse adulthood. I was never shown how to enter it. This created a quiet, accumulating frustration. It didn't erupt as rebellion. It settled as tension. I didn't want to be special. I didn't want to be spared life. I wanted to participate in it, to be allowed to try, to make mistakes, to learn through experience rather than observation. My bond with my brother shaped me profoundly. For many years, he was my hero, my world. We shared a room, shared experiences, shared small rituals of closeness that felt foundational. I idolized him. He was smart, technical, focused, already moving toward a future I admired but didn't yet understand. The memories remain vivid because they mattered. The dresser, the early calculator, the first computer, the games we played together, the quiet companionship of shared space. These weren't just details. They were proof of connection, of belonging. And then slowly something shifted. As he grew older, his attention moved elsewhere. Friends, interests, independence. I felt the distance before it was ever stated. That was one of my earliest lessons. Emotional change arrives as atmosphere long before it arrives as words. Withdrawal didn't announce itself. It seeped in as silence, dismissal, as being present but unseen. One moment stands out with painful clarity. I was still very young when he called me into his room while a friend was over and splashed cologne directly into my face, laughing. The burning lasted days. The emotional impact lasted far longer. It wasn't just the act itself. It was the realization that something precious had broken, and that I didn't understand why. The safety I had assumed was suddenly gone, replaced by confusion and shame I didn't yet have words for. From then on, connection felt unstable. I wanted closeness and felt rejection. I resented him and longed for him at the same time. That contradiction, love without reciprocity, lodged itself deeply. It would become a recurring pattern throughout my life, long before I could recognize it as such. My parents, too, embodied paradox. They were generous, materially supportive, outwardly loving. They encouraged creativity, imagination, and curiosity. so long as it remained contained. Emotional realities, however, were often dismissed or reframed. When I struggled, I was told I was too sensitive. When I noticed inconsistencies, I was told I was overreacting. When something felt wrong, I was assured that everything was fine. Praise was offered even when it didn't align with reality, creating confusion rather than confidence. I learned to doubt positive feedback as much as negative feedback because neither seemed anchored to what I was actually experiencing. Over time, I absorbed a subtle but corrosive lesson. Emotional truth was negotiable. What I felt could be overridden by what others preferred to believe. This taught me to doubt my perceptions while simultaneously sharpening them. I became hyper aware of subtext, tone, contradiction, and unspoken rules. Empathy wasn't a gift I cultivated, it was a survival skill I developed. I learned to read rooms, moods, and power dynamics because doing so reduced risk. Anticipating others' reactions became a way to stay safe. But the cost was high. I absorbed responsibility for emotions that weren't mine. I learned to hold discomfort silently. I learned to regulate others while ignoring myself. Gradually, I became the observer rather than the participant, present, perceptive, but not fully inhabiting my own life. This is the INFJ paradox in its earliest form, deep sensitivity paired with profound isolation. Even when I appeared functional or capable, I often felt as though I stood slightly outside the world, watching it rather than belonging to it. I could connect deeply with individuals, sometimes intensely, but struggled to find sustained reciprocity. I wanted meaning, truth, and emotional honesty. Most people wanted ease, hierarchy, or control. Over time, the internal world expanded further. It became not just a refuge, but a laboratory. Pain was analyzed. Patterns were tracked. Systems were questioned. I began to notice inconsistencies in families, schools, and institutions. The way power operated quietly, the way narratives formed regardless of truth, the way certain people were protected while others were blamed. I didn't yet have language for scapegoating, trauma, or misdiagnosis, but I felt their effects. What others called immaturity or rebellion was often resistance, an instinctive refusal to internalize rules that felt false or harmful. When authority conflicted with integrity, I sided with integrity, even when it cost me safety, approval, or belonging. By adolescence, the strain of carrying all of this, sensitivity, suppression, awareness, confusion, began to surface in destructive ways. I struggled with identity, regulation, and belonging. The inner world that once protected me became crowded with contradiction. It no longer felt purely safe, it felt heavy. I knew something was wrong, but I also knew it wasn't simply me. Looking back now, I can see that the traits that would later define me, empathy, intuition, pattern recognition, moral depth, were forged early under pressure. They were not signs of weakness. They were adaptations, responses to a world that did not know how to hold a child who felt too much, saw too much, and was never taught how to translate that sensitivity into self-trust. This is the making of an INFJ, not a personality type bestowed at birth, but a consciousness shaped through sensitivity, misattunement, and survival. A self that learned early how to endure invisibility without disappearing entirely. A mind that retreated inward not to escape reality, but to preserve something essential within it. Chapter 2: Mirrors, Silence, and the Cost of Being Seen. There is a moment, often early, often subtle, when you realize that being seen is not the same as being understood. For some people, being seen is welcomed. It feels affirming, stabilizing, even comforting. Attention reassures them that they exist as expected. For others, being seen is tolerated. It is something to manage, to control, to perform through. And for a few, being seen creates discomfort before a single word is spoken. Nothing has been said, no boundary crossed, no accusation made. And yet something tightens in the room. A shift occurs, not in you, but around you. You feel it before you can name it. This chapter is not about villains. It is about capacity, power, and what happens when truth enters systems that rely on silence to remain intact. The mirror effect, I learned early that I did not need to provoke people to unsettle them. Simply being present, observant, reflective, emotionally porous was often enough. I noticed tone before content, mood before explanation, inconsistency before confession. I didn't interrogate or confront. I listened. I registered. I remembered. This is what I later came to understand as the mirror effect. A mirror does not accuse, it does not argue. It does not demand change. It reflects. When someone reacts with immediate dislike, irritation, or hostility, without cause, without interaction, it is tempting to internalize the response. I'm unlikable. I did something wrong. There must be something off about me. But the mirror tells a different story. Often, what is being rejected is not the person in front of them, but what that person quietly reveals. Unexamined contradictions, buried shame, unresolved grief, or a self-image that cannot withstand reflection. The mirror does not create these fractures. It exposes them. And exposure is threatening when identity depends on not looking too closely. Silence is not neutral. Not all refusal is the same. There is a critical difference between inability and erasure, though they are often disguised in identical language. Some people cannot talk about the past because they are overwhelmed. This is a limit of capacity. It is often accompanied by discomfort, softness, accountability, or a genuine wish to return when strength allows. Others refuse to talk about the past because doing so would threaten their position. This is a limit of power. The sentence sounds the same. I don't want to talk about it. Let's move on. But the meaning is entirely different. When spoken by someone who holds social authority, moral credibility, or group backing, silence becomes coercive. It does not merely avoid pain. It preserves a narrative. In these moments, silence functions as gaslighting by default, not because it is overtly cruel, but because it denies the injured party the right to name harm. The refusal is not neutral, it is directional. It protects one reality by erasing another. When numbers protect ignorance. Truth does not prevail by accuracy alone. It prevails by context. When ignorance is shared, it becomes stable. When denial is collective, it feels like consensus. When everyone agrees not to look, the absence of examination becomes proof that nothing is wrong. A single dissenting voice, especially an awkward one, an emotionally intense one, or one already marked as difficult, can be dismissed without examination. This is how roles form. The one who speaks becomes the problem. The system that caused the harm disappears behind good intentions, tradition, or reputation. In such environments, asking to talk about the past is not heard as a request for understanding. It is experienced as a threat. The cost of staying repeated exposure to dismissal trains a person to shrink. At first, it is subtle. You pre-edit your truth. You soften language. You clarify before anyone asks. You apologize for existing. You begin to tell yourself that understanding others means enduring your own erasure. This is not compassion. It is slow self-abandonment. Understanding someone's limits does not require accepting your own diminishment. When a person says, "I can't talk about this because it hurts me," that may be a boundary. When a person says, "I won't talk about this because your feelings don't matter," that is a verdict. Learning the difference can save your sense of self. Why this hurts more in families. In professional or social settings, distance is possible. In families, it is not. The same dynamics that can be shrugged off elsewhere become devastating when they come from parents, siblings, or children. The instinct to stay, to explain, to repair, to earn understanding is powerful and often exploited, especially when love is confused with compliance, when silence is framed as maturity, when endurance is framed as loyalty, when questioning is framed as betrayal. The tragedy is not that some people cannot face the past. It is that those who can are often punished for trying. Being seen without being destroyed. The mirror does not demand change. It offers awareness. Those who cannot bear reflection will try to break the mirror or silence it. This chapter is not an argument for confrontation. It is an argument for discernment. If being yourself consistently results in dismissal, minimization, or enforced silence, the problem is not your depth. It is the environment's inability to hold it, and no amount of shrinking will ever make an unsafe system safe. Some truths cannot be spoken aloud immediately, but they must be written, if only so they are not lost. Chapter 3. Where we decide the problem lives. There is something deeply unsettling about how quickly we decide where a problem lives. Imagine a person who looks worn down by life. Their emotions seem erratic. They dissociate. They struggle to regulate themselves. They appear reactive, unstable, exhausted. Most of us have encountered someone like this, at work, in a family, on the street. They feel off, not dangerous, not cruel, just strained, hard to be around, difficult to place. If we knew this person had survived Years of visible trauma, a brutal divorce, repeated losses, a serious accident, sustained hardship, our reaction would change instantly. We would soften, we would contextualize, we would say, of course they're like this. Anyone would be. Their behavior would no longer be the story. Their history would. Now remove that context. The same person, the same symptoms, the same exhaustion, but no visible catastrophe. No obvious villain. No single moment we can point to and say, there, that's where it broke. Instead, we are told, they come from a good family. Nothing terrible happened. They've been like this for years. And just like that, the interpretation changes. Not gradually, not carefully, instantly. The question shifts, quietly but decisively, from what happened to them to what's wrong with them. This is where the system reveals itself, because when trauma is visible, we locate it in events. When trauma is invisible, we relocate it into the person. When trauma has no event. Most people who grow up in chronically invalidating environments do not know they were traumatized. There was no single event, no clear rupture, no moment that demanded intervention. What existed instead was pressure without relief, blame without explanation, emotional realities that were consistently denied, minimized, or reframed. Needs were inconvenient. Perception was negotiable. Distress was treated as overreaction. And because this was ordinary, because it was home, the person does not say, I was harmed. They arrive at a more stable conclusion. There must be something wrong with me. How the nervous system adapts. The nervous system does not argue with the environment. It adapts to it. Hypervigilance becomes baseline. Emotional flooding becomes familiar. Dissociation becomes refuge. These are not choices. They are calibrations. The body learns how much reality it is allowed to register. The mind learns which perceptions are safe to trust. The self learns how to remain functional in conditions that never stabilize. And because there was no named trauma, because nothing terrible happened, these adaptations are not recognized as survival. They are recognized as defect. Seeking help at the wrong door. So the person does what they are told to do. They seek help. They go to professionals believing, often desperately, that something inside them is broken and needs to be fixed. This is the moment where the trajectory should change. Too often it doesn't. Instead of asking what shaped the nervous system asks what label fits the symptoms. Instead of locating suffering in experience, it relocates it in identity. The question becomes diagnostic, not contextual, categorical, not historical. And the conclusion, however carefully worded, is the same. The problem lives in you. The quiet moral reversal. Nothing dramatic happens in this moment. No one intends harm, no one announces a mistake, and yet something irreversible occurs. The environment that caused the injury is no longer part of the equation. The patterns that created the pain remain unexamined. And the person who adapted to survive is now formally defined as disordered. This is not simply misdiagnosis. It is a reversal of cause and effect. The individual who endured becomes the problem. The system that shaped them disappears. For someone who has already spent a lifetime being told, directly or indirectly, that they are the problem, this does not feel new. It feels final. Confirmation that their pain has no context. Confirmation that resistance is pathology. Confirmation that the original explanation was correct. An identity becomes the illness. At this point, something essential gives way. If your suffering is trauma, it can be processed. If your suffering is circumstance, it can be understood. But if your suffering is who you are, there is no position left from which to question it. This is why so many people resist treatment they cannot articulate. This is why they push back. This is why they appear contradictory, reactive, difficult. It is not defiance. It is structural. It is the last remaining part of the self refusing to accept an explanation that erases reality. Being told you are sick when you were injured does not regulate the nervous system. It removes the possibility of regulation. And when even help confirms that the pain originates inside you, when authority aligns with the original distortion, isolation is no longer a feeling. It is a conclusion, a failure larger than the individual. This is not a failure of individuals. It is a failure of perception, and it does not remain contained. It scales across families, across workplaces, across institutions, across cultures. Because once harm is consistently located inside individuals instead of systems, the system no longer needs to change. It only needs to diagnose. And illusions, when repeatedly confirmed, stop appearing as illusions. They become doctrine. Chapter 4. The Cost of Empathy. Empathy did not enter my life as a value or a philosophy. It entered as awareness. I noticed things early. Shifts in mood, tension in voices, emotions people did not say out loud. I could feel when something was off, even when everyone insisted it wasn't. I did not try to do this. It happened. Other people's emotional states registered automatically, like background noise that could not be turned down. For a long time, I assumed everyone experienced the world this way. I was wrong. Most people move through life far less affected by what others are carrying. For me, there was no filter. Empathy inside the family system. Inside my family, this sensitivity did not make me valued. It made me disappear. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, I already had a role. I was too sensitive, overreacting, reading into things. My perceptions were dismissed before they were spoken. The conclusion existed before the observation. That distinction mattered. Within the family system, empathy did not lead to connection. It led to invalidation. My awareness was not treated as insight. It was treated as distortion. I learned something early. Noticing more did not mean being heard more. It meant being dismissed with greater certainty. Over time, this created a split. I still felt everything, but I stopped trusting that it had any place. Understanding became something I carried silently, because expressing it only reinforced the idea that I was the problem. Empathy. Outside the family system. Outside the family, something changed. Not in me. In context. When I entered new environments, work, friendships, unfamiliar social spaces, people did not have a pre-existing explanation for me. They responded to what was in front of them, and suddenly, the same empathy that had been dismissed at home made sense. People felt understood. They opened up. They responded to the way I listened, the way I noticed, the way I could name what was happening beneath the surface. That contrast mattered. In those spaces, I was not too much. I was useful, sometimes even valued, and that created tension. Because the core of me had not changed. Only the environment had. Inside the family, my empathy was treated as flawed. Outside it, the same empathy created connection. That contradiction does not resolve cleanly. It divides. Part of me recognized I was not broken. Another part had already learned not to trust that recognition. The internal conflict. This creates, living between those two realities, fractures consistency. In new environments, I could function, I could connect, I could be present and effective, but there was always a condition attached, a sense that acceptance was temporary, that once people really knew, the original pattern would return. So even when things worked, I did not settle into them. I stayed prepared. Empathy became both connection and exposure. I listened longer than I should have. I remained available beyond capacity because being needed felt safer than being evaluated. Burnout did not come from caring too much. It came from caring without boundary, without protection, without permission to withdraw. Being alone. When the system goes quiet, when I was alone, something clarified. The chaos was not constant. The confusion was not inherent. Without evaluation, dismissal, or projection, my thoughts stabilized. My emotional state regulated. That mattered. It meant the problem was not empathy. It was the environment empathy was forced to operate within. My nervous system was not disorganized by nature. It was responding to conditions where perception was punished and silence was safer. When pressure lifted, so did distortion. What this revealed about empathy. Eventually, something became clear. Empathy was never the issue. Context was. Empathy inside invalidation produces self-doubt. Empathy inside neutrality produces connection. Empathy without boundaries produces exhaustion. The task was never to feel less. It was to stop using empathy as proof of worth and to begin using it with choice. Nothing about me needed to be removed, but something needed to stop. Carrying environments that could not hold me. Clarity did not make things easier, but it made them stable. And for the first time, stability did not feel dangerous. How the split follows into adult life. The split does not remain in childhood. It transfers into workplaces, into institutions, into every environment where authority exists and perception matters. On the surface, functioning is possible. Competence is visible, sometimes even valued. But underneath, the same structure remains. Acceptance feels conditional. Stability feels temporary. Part of you anticipates exposure, not because there is something hidden, but because that was the rule. Being seen leads to correction. Correction leads to rejection. So even success carries tension. Praise feels provisional. Security feels borrowed. Effort is not just performance, it is delay. Awareness as a double bind. With awareness, participation is never neutral. You do not just function inside systems, you perceive them. You notice contradictions between what is said and what is rewarded. You sense power, inconsistency, and unspoken rules, often before they become visible to others. That creates a bind. If you speak, you are difficult. If you stay silent, you are complicit. So you remain inside structures that feel unstable, while knowing your discomfort will be interpreted as personal failure rather than accurate perception. The result is not just stress, it is separation. When alienation becomes identity, what begins as response becomes expectation. You do not just feel out of place, you assume it. The distance becomes constant, not dramatic, not visible, but persistent. This is how alienation internalizes, not as rebellion, not as anger, as quiet distance. You participate, but do not belong. You function, but do not settle. You are present, but not rooted. And because this formed before language, it does not feel acquired. It feels inherent. When awareness turns inward over time, the split collapses inward. By adulthood, difference is no longer questioned. It is expected. Each new environment is entered with the assumption that misunderstanding will occur. So even when competence is evident, there is an undercurrent of anticipation that something will be seen, that something will shift, that presence will become liability. This belief is not about ability, it is about conditioning. When perception is repeatedly invalidated, the person does not stop perceiving. They stop believing it is safe to perceive. This is where self-sabotage is misnamed. The issue is not desire to fail. The issue is inability to sustain suppression. Staying requires distortion, and the system eventually rejects that cost. So exit becomes regulation. Withdrawal becomes relief. Distance becomes necessary. Each exit reinforces the external narrative. They cannot stay. Each exit reinforces the internal one. I do not belong. Alienation deepens. Not because adaptation is impossible, but because adaptation has always required erasure. Closing. The cost that follows everywhere. By adulthood, empathy no longer feels like a gift or a burden. It feels constant, like gravity. The person can read rooms, anticipate reactions, and adapt endlessly, but not anchor. They can survive systems, but not belong within them. And this is not limited to one domain. The same pattern replicates across relationships, work, and social environments. Once awareness has been linked to consequence, the world no longer feels neutral. Authority resembles control. Groups resemble systems. Evaluation feels personal, even when it is not. Burnout does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. The nervous system does not fully rest. Every interaction carries signal. Every environment requires adjustment. Over time, only distance reduces pressure. Withdrawal is not failure. Isolation is not weakness. It is regulation. Not because resilience is absent, but because resilience has always required partial disappearance. And when identity is built on anticipation instead of permission, something fundamental is lost. The sense that existence does not need justification. That loss does not remain contained. It becomes the structure through which everything else is experienced. The breaking point. When trying harder stops working. By the time everything began to fall apart, I had already spent a lifetime trying to be understood, trying to be enough, trying to show love in ways that might finally be recognized. From early on, effort felt like the solution. If I could explain myself better, adapt more carefully, anticipate needs sooner, or prove my intentions clearly enough, something would eventually shift. Approval would come, stability would follow. It never did. The early lesson: love must be earned within the family system. The pattern formed early and without announcement. Affection was inconsistent and conditional. Moments of warmth appeared briefly, often after effort, compliance, or self-sacrifice, and then disappeared again. Nothing was stated outright. The lesson did not need to be. If you try harder, you might be accepted. So I tried harder. I adjusted to expectations that were never clearly defined. I pushed past discomfort. I minimized my own needs. I gave more, emotionally, mentally, practically, believing that persistence would eventually be recognized. But nothing resolved. No achievement settled the tension. No gesture secured stability. The harder I tried, the less visible the effort became. Over time, this stopped feeling like a problem to solve. It began to feel like a rule. Burnout without clarity. What wears a person down is not rejection alone. It is effort without outcome. Years of pushing without recognition do not produce understanding. They produce depletion. Exhaustion does not arrive as insight. It arrives as shutdown. By adulthood, I was no longer consciously believing approval was impossible. I was operating as if it were. My nervous system had already learned what my mind had not yet named. Nothing I did would change the result. This realization did not free me. It removed momentum. Familiar dynamics, different faces. When I entered relationships outside the family, the pattern did not disappear. It transferred. Not because I was seeking harm, because familiarity registers as safety when it is all you know. I was drawn to intensity, to attention, to emotional charge, especially in moments when I felt unanchored. Being seen felt stabilizing. Being wanted felt like relief. So I gave the way I always had. Understanding, patience, adaptation. I believed care could stabilize anything. What I did not yet recognize was the same structure forming again. Effort met with distance. Compliance met with approval. Authenticity met with withdrawal. The cycle repeated. Approach, response, brief warmth, absence, again and again. Why the empath doesn't leave from the outside, the question is simple. Why stay? But staying is not the mechanism. Trying is. The empath does not remain because they are weak, naive, or unaware. They remain because effort has been their primary language of survival. Leaving feels premature when you have been trained to believe that one more adjustment might finally work. What changes is not understanding. It is capacity. At a certain point, the system runs out. The body stops cooperating. Self-adjustment becomes intolerable. Not because clarity has arrived, because continuation is no longer possible. The shift is not a decision. It is a reduction, not I'm done. But I cannot keep disappearing to sustain this, when withdrawal looks like defiance. This is consistently misinterpreted. When the empath stops shrinking, it appears as resistance. When they stop pursuing approval, it appears as indifference. When they stop explaining, it appears as detachment. But nothing aggressive has occurred. There is no assertion of control, no strategy, no performance, only conservation. And because the system depended on their effort, it destabilizes the moment that effort is removed. Not because they left, because they were the one maintaining continuity. Collapse. Mistaken for failure. When this pattern repeats across relationships, workplaces, and institutions, a narrative forms. He cannot maintain stability. She is inconsistent. He sabotages himself. What is not visible is accumulation. Years of adapting to environments that never allowed rest, reciprocity, or grounding. By this point, exhaustion is structural. Motivation declines. Focus fragments. The body slows. Withdrawal appears. Depression follows, not as origin, as consequence. Once again, the individual is assigned responsibility for what the system produced. The breaking point. The breaking point is not dramatic, it is functional. It is the moment the body refuses to continue a strategy that has never produced stability. Trying stops, explaining stops, pleasing stops, not as insight, as survival. This is where endurance collapses under its own weight, where the person feels emptied, directionless, not because they are broken, because they have been operating without foundation. What fails here is not character. It is a survival strategy that could never sustain itself. And only after this collapse does a different question become possible. Not, what's wrong with me? But, what have I been adapting to all this time? 6. The spiritual side of the NFJ. Meaning, pattern, and the search for coherence. For as long as I can remember, there's always been another layer to how I experience things. Not something separate from reality. More like something woven into it. I didn't learn it. I didn't develop it. It was just there. A way of noticing things that didn't come through words or logic first. More like patterns, timing, meaning. Something that registered before I could explain it. And for a long time, I didn't question it. I assumed everyone experienced the world this way. It wasn't until later that I realized most people don't move through life tracking that kind of depth all the time. For me, that way of perceiving things became especially noticeable when surface explanations didn't make sense, when something felt off even if everything looked fine, when patterns kept repeating, when something inside me recognized meaning before I had any way of explaining why. At different points, I came across language that tried to describe this kind of experience: sensitivity, pattern recognition, difficulty filtering input. Today, some of it might be described as neurodivergence, but for me, the label never explained the experience. It only pointed to it: synchronicity, intuition, and knowing. There have been a lot of moments in my life where I just knew something, not in a dramatic way, not like a prediction, more like a quiet sense that something fit or didn't before there was any evidence. A situation would feel like it was going somewhere. A conversation would echo something I hadn't said out loud yet. Events would line up in ways that didn't seem random, but also didn't feel magical, just coherent. And I didn't trust it at first, because it didn't come with proof. It didn't explain itself. It didn't ask for attention. It was just there, consistent, subtle, hard to ignore once you noticed it. And over time, I realized that ignoring it usually came with a cost, not because something bad would happen externally, but because I would end up out of alignment with myself. Listening didn't make things easier, but it kept things honest. Eventually, I stopped thinking of it as knowing the future or anything like that. It was just pattern recognition, a way of sensing when something internally and externally matched and when it didn't. The indigo archetype and sensitivity. At some point, I came across the idea of the indigo archetype. I didn't take it literally, but I understood what it was trying to describe: a certain kind of sensitivity, a nervous system that picks up on things quickly, that reacts to inconsistency, that doesn't tolerate things that don't make sense on a deeper level. The label didn't matter. What mattered was recognizing the pattern in myself. Dishonesty didn't feel like an abstract concept to me. It felt physical. Power dynamics weren't subtle. They were obvious. Emotional undercurrents weren't hidden. They were constant, and there wasn't really a way to turn that off. Crowded environments drained me. Performative behavior felt unbearable. And once I noticed something, I couldn't unnotice it. That brought a kind of clarity, but it also created distance, not dramatic isolation, just a constant sense of being slightly out of sync with what was happening around me, present, but not aligned. Seeing meaning and pattern meaning didn't just come from thinking things through. It showed up in patterns, in repetition, in timing, the same idea appearing in different places, a song showing up at the exact moment it matched what I was feeling. Different people saying the same thing without knowing each other. I never saw these as messages from somewhere else. They felt more like reflections, something internal being mirrored back through the outside world. It made life feel less random, more layered, like things weren't just happening. They were pointing. But I also learned that this kind of perception needs balance, because if you don't stay grounded, everything starts to feel meaningful. And when everything feels meaningful, nothing is clear anymore. Pattern recognition can turn into overinterpretation. Meaning can turn into noise. So I had to learn when to pay attention and when to step back, when to interpret, and when to just let things be. Trauma and perception. At some point, I stopped seeing trauma and this kind of awareness as separate things. Because trauma sharpens perception. It has to. When things are unstable, you start paying attention to everything. Tone, timing, atmosphere. Nothing feels neutral. Your system learns to pick up on small changes because those changes matter. Pain forces you inward. Loss strips away assumptions. Betrayal removes the idea that things are automatically safe, not because suffering is meaningful, but because it removes distraction. It leaves you with what's actually there. Trauma doesn't give you insight. It just removes the things that were in the way of seeing clearly. When the system finally stops responding, there's a point where trying stops working. Not because you decide to stop, because you can't keep going. Everything that used to help, effort, understanding, explaining, just stops making a difference. Insight doesn't help. Trying harder doesn't help. Even hope starts to feel like pressure instead of relief. And at that point, it's not confusion. It's exhaustion. Exhaustion from repeating the same patterns over and over again. By then, you've already tried to fit into different systems: family, relationships, work, institutions. And the message underneath all of them has been the same. Something about you doesn't fit. Each attempt takes something out of you, until eventually, even standing up for yourself becomes too much. The collapse isn't dramatic. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal, But internally, it's just the system shutting down because it can't keep adapting. Energy drops, motivation disappears, engagement stops, not because you've agreed with anything, because you can't continue. What looks like apathy is actually preservation. What looks like giving up is the last form of self-protection. Collapse, mistaken for illness. And this is where things often get misunderstood. Because when someone reaches that point, the world responds in a very specific way. More evaluation, more labels, more attempts to fix what's happening. And the same message shows up again. The problem is you. And after hearing that enough times, even if you don't fully believe it, part of you starts to question yourself. Not because it feels true, because it's constant. But the reality is, you don't have to be mentally unwell to break down. If you push any system far enough, it will stop responding. The symptoms look the same: withdrawal, exhaustion, shutdown. But those aren't personality flaws, they're limits being reached. And strangely, it's right there at that point that something begins to shift, where awakening begins. When there's no energy left to perform, something drops. The need to be understood fades. The need to be accepted weakens. The need to keep explaining yourself disappears. Not because you've made peace with everything, because you don't have the energy to keep distorting yourself, and that creates space, not comfortable space, clear space. Without all the effort to maintain a certain version of yourself, perception changes. You stop bending to fit, you just see. And that's where something like awakening begins, not as expansion, as reduction, less distortion, less effort, more clarity, meaning without illusion. At that point, the question of meaning changes. It's no longer about belief, it's about structure. Does pain have meaning, or do we create meaning because we need things to make sense? Without meaning, pain feels random, and randomness destabilizes everything. With meaning, it becomes something you can move through. Not justified, not erased, just integrated. So the focus shifts from trying to find answers to learning how to relate to what's happening, how to stay aware without turning against yourself, how to feel things without becoming defined by them, how to sit in uncertainty without forcing a conclusion. Meaning doesn't fix anything, it just gives you orientation. When insight becomes weight, seeing things clearly isn't neutral. It comes with weight, because once you see patterns, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to not knowing. There were times I wished I could simplify everything, turn it off, stop noticing so much. But the same awareness that exhausted me also kept me from going in the wrong direction. It corrected me. It pulled me back when something didn't align. It kept me honest. So even though it wasn't comfortable, it was accurate, and that mattered more. The spiritual side of this isn't about escaping reality. It's about engaging with it more deeply, seeing patterns, noticing contradictions, understanding things as they actually are, not just how they're presented, and learning how to live with that level of awareness without letting it consume you, because at a certain point, that's not optional. It's just part of how you experience the world. Chapter 7, The Mirror and the Alien, Reflections on Self and Other. For as long as I can remember, there's been a part of me that watches, not in a detached, dissociated way. I'm still there, still feeling, but at the same time, I'm also observing, noticing patterns, noticing reactions, noticing the gap between what's happening and what people say is happening. That way of being didn't come from trying to be self-aware, it just developed. Over time, I started to understand that experience through two ideas that kept showing up for me: the mirror and the alien. The mirror was about seeing myself clearly. The alien was about the parts of me that didn't seem to fit anywhere, and both of those developed at the same time. The mirror, seeing without adjusting. For most of my life, I didn't really see myself clearly. Not because I couldn't, but because I learned to adjust before I ever learned to look. I became what was needed first, what kept things stable, what avoided conflict. So instead of forming an identity based on what was true, I formed one based on what worked. Looking at myself honestly didn't feel natural at first. It felt like confrontation, not with an ideal version of who I should be, but with what was actually there underneath all the adapting. Who was I when I wasn't adjusting, when I wasn't anticipating, when I wasn't managing other people's reactions? That kind of honesty doesn't feel good at the beginning. It shows you things you didn't want to see, patterns you didn't realize you had, ways you've been shaped by things you didn't choose. The mirror didn't comfort me, it corrected me. And even though that eventually becomes stabilizing, at first it can feel like everything is shifting under your feet. The alien, the parts that don't translate. At the same time I started seeing myself more clearly, I also became more aware of how out of place I felt, not just with other people, but with parts of myself. There were ways I experienced things that didn't seem to match the environment I was in. I cared about things that others brushed off. I noticed things that weren't being acknowledged. I reacted to things that didn't seem to affect anyone else. That created a strange kind of distance. Not dramatic isolation, just a constant feeling of being slightly out of sync. The alien, for me, isn't something extreme or exaggerated. It's the quiet parts that don't translate. The intuition that doesn't fit into simple explanations, the empathy that gets misunderstood, the sensitivity that gets labeled as too much. It's not about being special, it's about being mismatched. And when that mismatch happens over and over again, especially early in life, it stops feeling like I don't fit here. It starts to feel like there's something different about me. Integrating what was split, for a long time, I tried to organize myself. There were parts of me that were acceptable and parts that weren't. The parts that worked stayed visible. The parts that didn't got pushed down. I separated strength from vulnerability, insight from pain, clarity from instability. And for a while, that worked. But it didn't last. At some point, everything you've pushed aside starts to show up again. Not all at once, but enough that you can't keep pretending those parts aren't there. Integration didn't mean fixing anything. It meant stopping the separation. It meant realizing that the same sensitivity that overwhelmed me was also what allowed me to understand things deeply. That anger wasn't just a problem, it was information. That grief wasn't weakness, it was continuity. That the parts of me I thought I needed to remove were actually parts that needed context. Without that, everything stays fragmented. You can understand pieces of yourself, but never the whole. Seeing what remains after everything breaks. There were points in my life where things didn't hold together. Loss, betrayal, instability, the kind of experiences that strip away any sense of control. At first, that doesn't bring clarity. It just leaves you with what's left. No explanation, no narrative, just experience. But over time, something starts to shift. You realize that meaning doesn't come from things being stable. It comes from being able to stay present with what's happening, even when it's not. Insight doesn't come because pain is valuable. It comes because pain removes everything that isn't sustainable. What's left is real. Not because it's ideal, but because it's what remains when everything else falls away. For me, anything that felt spiritual wasn't something outside of that. It was the ability to stay aware inside it, to not disappear when things became difficult, to not disconnect from what was happening. That didn't come from trying. It came from not being able to maintain distance anymore. The Ellie and the alien. The idea of Ellie and the alien feels like a conversation inside me. Ellie is the part that observes without judging. The alien is the part that feels unfamiliar, out of place, or hard to accept. For a long time, my instinct was to correct the alien, to explain it, to adjust it, to make it fit. But that changed. Instead of correcting, I started paying attention. Instead of explaining, I started observing. Instead of dismissing, I started allowing. And what I realized is that the parts that feel most unfamiliar are often the ones carrying the most accurate information. They just don't come in a form that's easy to accept. Structure and intuition. There's always been a tension in me between two ways of understanding things. One part of me wants structure, clear explanations, cause and effect, something that makes sense logically. The other part just knows. It picks up on patterns, inconsistencies, alignment, without needing to explain them right away. For a long time, those two parts felt like they were in conflict, but they're not. They need each other. Without structure, intuition can drift. Without intuition, structure becomes rigid. Clarity comes from letting both exist, not choosing one over the other. The human and the observer. The mirror and the alien aren't two different identities. They're two aspects of the same awareness. One sees clearly, the other feels out of place. Being human means feeling contradiction. Being aware means being able to see that contradiction without collapsing into it. Integration, for me, isn't about rising above anything. It's about staying present inside it. Chapter 8. The Recovery of the True Self. Recovery didn't come as a breakthrough. It didn't feel like a moment where everything suddenly made sense. It came slowly, unevenly, and more often than not, it came through exhaustion rather than hope. Before anything really changed, one question started to surface. Which parts of me are actually me, and which parts are things I learned to become just to survive? That question didn't bring clarity. It brought confusion, disorientation, but it was the first honest place I had been in a long time. Recognizing adaptation versus identity. For most of my life, I thought my patterns were just who I was. The hyper-awareness, the need to manage people's reactions, holding things in, taking on more than I should. I saw those as personality traits, but they weren't. They were strategies. Things I learned in environments where paying attention mattered more than expressing myself, where getting it wrong had consequences. Over time, those strategies stopped feeling like something I was doing. They started feeling like who I was, and that's where things get confusing. Because when survival becomes identity, you don't question it. Recovery didn't start with fixing anything. It started with a different question, not what's wrong with me, but what did I learn to become in order to get through what I was in? That shift changed everything. It didn't excuse anything, it didn't erase responsibility, but it made things make sense. It showed me that a lot of what I struggled with wasn't broken, it was learned, and it had worked. Just not anymore. The part of me underneath all of that didn't come back all at once. It wasn't dramatic. It was quieter, less reactive, less focused on managing everything. And at first, it felt unfamiliar. Letting go of protection. Letting go of those patterns didn't feel freeing at first. It felt exposed because those defenses had been doing something for a long time. They had protected me. So removing them didn't create safety. It removed the layer that had been keeping things manageable. And it didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. Control, overthinking, emotional distance, blaming myself for things that weren't mine. As those started to loosen, something else came up. Grief. Not vague, not general, specific. Things I didn't receive, things I had to carry too early, things that were expected without support. There wasn't a single release, no big moment where it all came out, just a slow process of noticing, of seeing what was there. Sometimes being able to sit with it, sometimes not. Recovery didn't mean doing it perfectly. It meant being honest about what was happening. Relearning how to speak to myself. One of the hardest parts was realizing how I spoke to myself. I had always thought that voice in my head was just me, but it wasn't neutral. It was critical, harsh, demanding. And it felt normal, like that was what responsibility sounded like. Pain wasn't allowed. Needs felt like a problem. Any reaction I had felt like something I needed to correct. Over time, I started to see that voice differently. It wasn't insight, it was learned, something I had internalized. And changing it didn't happen overnight. It started with pulling it back, making it more neutral, less exaggerated, more accurate. Eventually, that turned into something closer to understanding, and later, something closer to kindness. Not in a soft or comforting way, in a corrective way. Something that actually made things clearer instead of more distorted. Forgiveness worked the same way. It wasn't about saying everything was okay. It was about recognizing context, that I made decisions based on what I understood at the time, that I didn't always have the clarity I have now, that there were limits to what I could handle. And that matters. Finding my voice again. For a long time, silence felt safer than speaking. Not always because someone told me to be quiet, but because speaking had consequences. So I learned to hold things in, to filter, to reduce. Over time, that turned into something else. It wasn't just restraint, it was absence. Recovery meant finding a way to express things again, not by being louder, not by forcing anything, but by being precise. Writing became the way I could do that. It gave me space, time, no interruption, no immediate reaction. I could say what was true without needing to defend it. That's how my voice started to come back, not through volume, through accuracy. Saying what's real without adjusting it to make it easier for someone else to hear. Learning to feel without losing control. For a long time, emotions didn't feel safe. They escalated quickly. They overwhelmed me, and they often came with shame. So the alternative was to shut them down, to keep things controlled. But that doesn't actually remove emotion, it just builds pressure. Learning to feel, again, wasn't about becoming more emotional. It was about becoming more stable inside emotion, slowing things down, noticing what I was feeling earlier, letting it exist without reacting immediately, grief without collapsing, relief without expecting it to disappear. Safety didn't come from avoiding difficult feelings. It came from realizing I could experience them and still stay present. Relearning intuition. Trauma changed how I related to intuition. Everything started to feel like a signal, like something was about to go wrong. So it became hard to tell the difference between actual intuition and fear. Recovery meant separating those two, learning what was coming from clarity and what was coming from anticipation. And as that started to settle, something came back. Not certainty, not control, but a kind of reliability, a sense of direction. Intuition stopped feeling like something urgent and started feeling like something steady. And with that, small moments of something else showed up. Not big happiness, not constant relief, but moments of alignment, clarity, being present without overthinking it, joy in a quieter form, something that didn't depend on anyone else's reaction, just on whether things felt true, meaning and function. I stopped looking for purpose as something outside of me, something I was supposed to find. Instead, it started to form out of what I had already been through, taking experience and making sense of it, turning confusion into something clear, turning pain into something that could be understood. That's not identity, it's function. Sensitivity doesn't mean you have to carry everything, it means you have to choose what you engage with. Discernment matters, because without it, everything becomes overwhelming. But with it, experience becomes information. And when that information is shared, it becomes connection. Recovery isn't going back to who I was before. It's the first time I'm actually showing up as myself. Not completely, not perfectly, but present, aware, and not disappearing anymore. Love, trust, and betrayal. Love, for me, never felt simple. It wasn't something I could just relax into. It came layered, with vigilance, with longing, with memory, with restraint. I wanted connection, deeply. But at the same time, there was always something in me preparing for it to shift, preparing for it to change, preparing for it to end. So even when things were good, there was a part of me that couldn't fully settle into it. Understanding that didn't come from blaming anyone. It came from recognizing a pattern, seeing it clearly enough to stop repeating it. How trauma shapes relationships. I started to realize that trauma doesn't stay in the past. It changes what you expect. It teaches your body what closeness costs, how long safety lasts, when something good is likely to turn. In my case, emotional inconsistency early on trained me to pay attention to everything. Silence didn't feel neutral. Distance didn't feel normal. Change didn't feel like change. It felt like loss already happening. Even when nothing was wrong, my body reacted like something was about to be. I didn't learn how to receive love. I learned how to monitor it, how to track it, how to anticipate when it might disappear. I knew how to survive relationships, but I didn't know how to feel safe inside them. The experience of abandonment. For a long time, I thought I had a fear of abandonment. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized it wasn't fear, it was memory. I had experienced connection ending before, care being pulled away without explanation, distance showing up without warning. So when something felt unstable, my system wasn't imagining a future. It was recognizing something familiar. That changes everything. Because fear is about what might happen. This was about what already had. So when closeness triggered something in me, it wasn't insecurity. It was my system trying to stay intact, trying not to lose itself in something that might disappear. I still wanted connection, but I also needed to protect myself from losing it, recognizing dysfunction, and staying anyway. Over time, I got very good at recognizing when something was off. I could feel imbalance early, when I was giving more than I was receiving, when responsibility wasn't shared, when boundaries were being pushed. The problem wasn't seeing it. The problem was leaving, because what felt unhealthy also felt familiar. And familiar feels safe, even when it isn't. Healthy dynamics, on the other hand, felt strange. Calm felt empty. Consistency felt uncertain. So even when I knew something wasn't right, that didn't automatically create distance. Because trauma doesn't just affect how you see things, it affects what you stay connected to. The trauma bond. Looking back, I can see that what kept me in certain situations wasn't love, it was intensity. The cycle. closeness then distance, connection then withdrawal, relief then disruption. I stayed not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because it made sense to my system. Empathy kept me invested, hope kept me waiting, familiarity kept me attached. Leaving didn't feel like clarity, it felt like breaking something unfinished, like walking away meant abandoning the possibility that it might finally stabilize. Because somewhere along the way, I had learned that staying longer meant caring more, that trying harder meant loving better, that if I just understood enough, things would change. But trauma bonds don't hold because we're confused. They hold because they mean something to us. Relearning what love is. At some point, I had to start questioning what I thought love was, not as an idea, but as something I had actually been living. I had to see that love wasn't giving without receiving, staying when something was hurting me, being silent when something wasn't right. Real love felt different, more stable, less intense. It didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. It didn't require me to shrink in order to maintain it. And that felt unfamiliar at first, almost underwhelming, because I was used to intensity. But over time, I started to understand that safety doesn't feel like intensity. It feels like regulation, like something that doesn't constantly activate your system. Learning that meant trusting consistency instead of chasing emotional highs, boundaries, and leaving. For a long time, boundaries didn't feel like an option. Saying no felt dangerous. Leaving felt like failure. But that started to change. I began to see that boundaries aren't about pushing people away. They're about defining where I end. Leaving didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped abandoning myself. And that shift mattered, because I realized that dignity doesn't come from being understood. It comes from staying aligned with what I know is true. Each time I set a boundary, it wasn't about control. It was about clarity. When leaving is misunderstood, from the outside, leaving can look like avoidance, like not taking responsibility, like giving up. But for me, it was the opposite. There were moments where I simply couldn't continue, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't have the capacity anymore. And that's something people don't always see. They see the outcome, the absence, the change, but they don't see what's happening internally. The exhaustion, the disorientation, the effort it takes just to stay functional. Leaving wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about preserving enough of myself to be able to function at all. Because once you collapse completely, there's nothing left to give. Building connection differently. The biggest shift came when I stopped building relationships from what I was missing and started building them from where I actually was, I stopped looking for people to fix things they didn't break. I stopped needing intensity to feel connected. I started choosing relationships that allowed space, closeness without pressure, connection without performance, and that felt different, slower, less consuming, but more stable, more real. This isn't a perfect place. It's not an ending. It's movement. Love is still complicated. Trust still takes time, but it's no longer driven by the same patterns. I'm not trying to become someone else in order to be accepted. I'm showing up as I am. And for the first time, that feels like something I can actually sustain. Chapter 10. Integration. Living authentically. Integration isn't something I arrived at. It's something I started living, not as a fixed state, but as a way of no longer splitting myself into what's acceptable and what isn't. For most of my life, I survived by separating parts of myself. Empathy was okay. Anger wasn't. Intuition stayed private. Strength was visible. Vulnerability stayed hidden. That was the structure, and it worked for a while. Integration started when I stopped organizing myself that way, when I stopped deciding which parts of me were allowed to exist and started letting them exist together. It didn't feel like becoming someone new. It felt like returning to something that had always been there. The balance between empathy and self-protection. Empathy has always been a big part of how I move through the world, but without boundaries, it became too much. I took in more than I could handle, gave more than I could sustain, stayed in situations that slowly wore me down. At some point, I had to face something uncomfortable. What I thought was compassion was actually me disappearing. For a long time, my system ran on one rule: make yourself smaller so things stay stable. So I adjusted, softened what I said, held things in, carried what other people didn't want to carry. Learning self-protection didn't mean shutting down. It meant choosing. where I show up, how much I give, when to stop. And that shift mattered. Because I realized that protecting myself wasn't in conflict with empathy. It was the only way empathy could actually last. Accepting the limits of others, I also had to look at how I was relating to other people. For a long time, I expected things I never said out loud: depth, consistency, awareness. And when those weren't there, I felt it, even if I didn't say anything. Over time, I started to see something more clearly. Most people aren't trying to harm you. They're just limited by their own fears, their defenses, their patterns, things they've never had to question. Accepting that didn't mean tolerating behavior that hurt me. It meant seeing people as they are, not as who I hoped they could be. And that changed how I related to them. Less projection, clearer boundaries, more grounded expectations. Grounding awareness. My mind has always been active, always connecting things, seeing patterns, finding meaning, but without grounding, it can go too far. Everything starts to feel important, everything starts to carry weight, and that becomes overwhelming. So I had to learn how to ground that, not by shutting it off, but by stabilizing it. Routine, physical presence, simple structure, things that bring me back into the moment. That didn't take anything away from how I think or perceive. It made it usable. It made it something I could actually live with. Insight stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like guidance. The INFJ's function, I used to feel like I had to carry things for other people, fix things, hold space for everything. But that's not actually my role. What I do is more specific. I notice, I understand, I translate things into something clearer. I can sit with complexity without needing to resolve it immediately. And that doesn't require me to sacrifice myself. It requires me to stay present, to stay aware, to not distort what I see just to make things easier. I'm not here to fix everything. I'm here to engage with things honestly. Transforming experience. What I've been through shaped how I see things, but it doesn't define me. Integration changed how I relate to it. Instead of something that overwhelms me, it became something I can work with. What I went through became information. What I lost became perspective. What destabilized me became something I can now hold without collapsing. Not because it's okay, but because I understand it. Purpose didn't come from outside. It formed through this process, making sense of things, finding clarity, being able to communicate that. That's where meaning comes from. Not from avoiding pain, but from understanding it. Living from orientation, fear used to drive a lot of my decisions. Not imagined fear, remembered experiences, patterns I had already lived through. Intuition was always there too, but I didn't always trust it. Now I do, not because it removes uncertainty, but because it gives direction. It tells me when something aligns, when something doesn't, and I follow that, even when it's uncomfortable. Fear still shows up, but it doesn't lead anymore. Stability within contradiction. I'm not just one thing. I never was. I can be sensitive and strong, withdrawn and connected, affected and grounded. For a long time, I thought I had to resolve that. Choose one, become something consistent. But integration didn't do that. It removed the need to. Now those things just exist together. And I don't fight that anymore. That's where the stability comes from. Not from simplifying who I am, but from allowing all of it. I don't feel like everything is perfect or finished, but I do feel steady, and that's different. For the first time, that feels like something real. Epilogue. The journey continues. Choosing presence over erasure. This doesn't end with everything figured out. It doesn't end with resolution. It ends with direction. Healing, for me, isn't a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. It's not closure. It's not some clean understanding that ties everything together. It's the ability to stay present with myself, without shutting down, without numbing, without turning away from what took so long to see. The past didn't disappear. What changed is that I don't have to disappear anymore to survive it. What healing means. Healing means I don't need to prove anything anymore. I don't need to convince anyone that what I experienced was real, or that it mattered. My system is slowly learning that I can stay present, without losing myself. I can feel things without collapsing, remember things without being pulled back into them, move through life without constantly watching myself. It's not consistent. Some days feel clear, some don't, but both are part of it. What matters is that I recognize myself now as someone worth taking care of, including by me. Gratitude for what remained, Gratitude for me isn't about pretending things were good. It's about recognizing what stayed intact. The parts of me that held on quietly, even when nothing supported them. The intuition that didn't disappear, the empathy that didn't shut down, the part of my mind that kept trying to make sense of things, even when nothing made sense. Gratitude and grief exist together. They don't cancel each other out. A message to those who see themselves here. If any of this feels familiar, if you felt like too much, too sensitive, too aware, that's not the problem. It never was. The problem is where that sensitivity exists, in environments that don't support it, in systems that reward disconnection, in spaces where depth isn't understood. You're not broken. You're responding to what you experienced. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to step back. You're allowed to define what healing looks like for you. The quiet strength of authenticity. Authenticity doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to prove itself. It shows up in smaller ways, in the boundaries you keep, in the things you say honestly, in the choices you make that align with who you actually are. It often looks like less explaining, less performing, less trying to be understood by everyone. For me, it's not about being understood anymore. It's about being coherent within myself, choosing light without denying the dark. I don't move towards something better by pretending the past didn't happen. I move forward by including what it taught me. The difficult parts shaped how I see. What I lost showed me what matters. What hurt me clarified what I won't accept. Ignoring that would just be another way of disconnecting. Choosing something better doesn't mean rejecting what was hard. It means staying aware, staying present, not turning away from complexity. The movement forward isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming whole. And for me, that's enough.